Welcome, welcome, welcome. Jake Williams for Condition InfoSec here. Wanted to chat a little bit about election security. All right, so not just election security, but Georgia election security, near and dear to my heart, because of course Georgia has been in my home state now for almost, checks watch, 2 decades, and also the home state of Rendition InfoSec, where we headquarter. Back in 2016, there was a open server that folks were contending contained a lot of data that's been downplayed a lot by a lot of folks. But a computer security expert, Mr. Lamb, says that he found evidence in a forensic image of the election server, and says it shows signs that the server was hacked, and the server was left open for a long time, and was discovered in August 2016 ahead of the election. Now, this was seriously concerning at the time, but we have to note here that it was wiped clean in mid 2017. Now, this is particularly concerning when it comes down to it, because, well, wow, why would we wipe the server, right? And we, meaning why did the government or the state of Georgia, I guess the state government of Georgia, decide to wipe this server? And the answer is, well, we don't know for sure, but I'll mention here that when state officials consistently have said, or not when, state officials have consistently said there's no evidence whatsoever that there was any foul play at all on this server. Now, obviously, there's some, what would we call this? A conflict of interest, right? When the state has a server that's been breached, and they say, oh, no, don't worry, no big deal, or at least left data open to the internet, and then we'll just go ahead and say, yes, then breached. Obviously concerning, right? And so Logan Lamb, basically a security expert, he filed an affidavit in federal court and said, hey, there is evidence suggesting the server was compromised in December 2014. And by the way, for those that don't know, this was running Drupal. For the life of me, I don't know why, I don't know why. Let me back up and say, wow, content management systems are awesome. You have to patch them, right? You absolutely have to patch them. And while they're awesomer than they used to be, we're dating back to 2014 here, and in 2014, practically every content management system out there was just a hot mess of nasty. And certainly Drupal was no exception. In fact, you can Google Drupalgeddon, and you will see multiple results, not because multiple stories about Drupalgeddon, because of multiple instances of Drupalgeddon occurring. All right. Lamb looked at the computer logs, and I think that this is probably the most important point here that I saw, is that the computer logs, the server logs, only go back to November 10th, 2016. Now, I want to talk about this real quick here because I'm sure that there are going to be people out here that are going to play this one way or another. I can see the conspiracy theorists kind of kicking out here and being like, well, obviously this was deleted to cover up evidence, that may have helped, basically of hacking, that may have helped sway the election and whatever. Look, man, it's 2020. We're past that, right? I mean, I hate to be that guy, but we're past that, right? What I'm interested in knowing here is, were those logs deleted intentionally, right? Or were they purely, to add kind of the story here a little bit, were they deleted intentionally, or was this purely log rotation? This stuff happens all the time, right? We work forensic cases all the time and incident responses all the time over rendition, where we, it turns out, we just have just not enough data there, right? Very rarely do we say, wow, what are we going to do with all that data? Very frequently what happens, unfortunately, is that we go in and we're looking and like, okay, yeah, what are we going to do with all that data, right? And we roll back and we're like, yeah, and we roll back and it's like within, you're just right there at the actual initial intrusion point, and the logs go almost back that far, but not quite. Okay, so let's talk about this. The server was imaged in March, right? So March 2017. The server, there was a forensic image of the server taken. How standard would it be then? I think this is an important question to answer. How standard would it be for those logs not to go back and also not to be retained? Now, at the point that the server got imaged, we have to note here that, or have to kind of note that In addition to basically any logs on the server, obviously the FBI, and by the way, it's also worth mentioning it's the FBI, not the state of Georgia. It's the FBI that images the server, right? So plot thickens a little bit, right? And I say plot thickens not because I'm like, woo, FBI. It's all about the fact that the state probably should have imaged this at the first sign of intrusion. And my goodness, man, definitely as folks were continuing kind of to discuss the issues around this. And gosh, I mean, like, if you're a state election official, would you not want to image one of these servers after the fact and keep that around for, I don't know, some period of time? Again, if this is a critical underpinning of the election system, totally yes, I would want to do that. But the logs only go back to November 10th. Now, mind you, we're talking a very, very specific time period, November 10th. Now, it's worth mentioning here that in March 2017, the server is still open to the internet, records are still exposed, and the state gets notified again about this, and this is ultimately when basically when the election, when the FBI is notified and they take a forensic image of the server, right? Basically, Lamb says that he found evidence that other election-related files were deleted from the server on March 2nd, 2017, just after a colleague of his alerted KSU officials that the election server remained vulnerable to hackers. Okay, so we have two very important dates here. The first one is November 10th. The second one is March 2nd, right? And again, just want to provide some context around this for those that don't do a lot of incident response or forensics and are trying to make sense of this. I'm not going to fly the conspiracy flag. You draw your own conclusions. I certainly am not here to do that. What I do want to talk about, though, is normal log retention, right? So March 2nd is when files were deleted. We don't have the date, or I don't have the date immediately available when the server was imaged, but standard log retention schemes are generally 30, 60, 90, 120 days, 6 months, a year, right? So 120 is pretty uncommon. 30, 60, 90, 6 months, a year, right, are generally our log timeframes, or in some really bad cases, 7 days. Gosh, we saw one with 18 minutes. Like crazy looking times here. But let's talk about this. So November, if we're talking about a 90-day log retention, November 10th. Basically, if you, without getting super mathy here, November to December, December to January, January to February, that's 90 days, right? This concerns me a little bit, right? Because it doesn't seem like a very standard log retention. And also, I would expect Lamb probably would have specified in the affidavit if indeed if indeed they're these aged off as part of normal log retention. Now, we've seen some cases in the past. In fact, we've been involved in a couple of cases in the past where particularly in civil litigation type stuff. With like with the with the civil litigation kind of stuff, we do see some of these weird scenarios where people will maybe wait to turn over a piece of it. They're like, oh, we totally meant to image that, but then we got around to it, and what do you know? They got around to it the day after the logs aged off normally, right? Obviously, again, kind of concerning here, and particularly election-related files being deleted from the server. Yeah, I am definitely, going to agree with Lamb here. Lamb says that suggests foul play, 100%. Now, foul play, I want to be clear that we are not certain whether the logs were deleted by hackers or by the basically by state staff. Who knows, right? But again, when he talks about no legitimate reason why records from that critical period of time would have been deleted, I 100% agree with this, right? There is no question. There's just no question. Even, again, I'm not trying to use hindsight bias here. Obviously, we know a lot more about the 2016 election interference now than we did in late 2016, early 2017. But come on. The idea that, listen, as a forensics professional, as an information security professional, anything, one, the odds that these logs were, or the idea that these logs were not being forwarded to some central repository off that server and weren't preserved is just crazy train from a basically from a election security standpoint. That's just nuts. right? Secondarily, the idea that it would stop at exactly that date that doesn't match any normal log retention without any other explanation around that. Again, I'm just going to throw the crazy train flag here. And look, in a normal case, right, in a normal civil case, one of the things that we deal with is this concept called spoliation, right? And spoliation basically is did one party intentionally delete evidence or fail to take reasonable and customary precautions to ensure that evidence was preserved. I think here we can agree that if evidence wasn't deleted directly, right, then, again, what would that, basically, if evidence wasn't deleted directly by the state, by hackers that had access to the server, or whatever, the state definitely failed to maintain logs. There's just no, I don't know how else you would, how you'd make an argument there around that, because again, we certainly don't have those logs available. I'm going to mention here as well, and I'm not sure how I feel about this, but a protective order has prevented Lamb from speaking to reporters about his findings in general. That obviously is concerning to me because, obviously this is a huge public interest story. I understand the need to not hype it, but wow, that is wow. Yeah, I do want some evidence to come out around this. I think if Lamb had been able to speak to reporters earlier, certainly we would have the public would have a better understanding of this, and I think we'd have more focus on election security here in Georgia, running up to even the 2018 elections, which you may remember the former Secretary of State, now Governor, Mr. Kemp. Accused basically, or made some claims around Democrats trying to hack some election systems and the whole. I feel like had this been out here, and by the way, he provided no proof whatsoever about that. But the reality was that had this been out there in 2016 and 2017, let's just go with 2017, had Lamb been talking to folks about the evidence that he had examined, I suspect. Without having that whole protective order, I suspect that we'd have a little bit more, would have had a little bit more, certainly more focus around election security, particularly in the state of Georgia, if not nationally. And I suspect that those 2018 claims would have gone, they didn't go unchecked. A number of members of the press really picked up and ran with that, really calling Kemp out and saying, hey, brother, proof or it didn't happen. But hey, right, again, we are where we are. Just kind of calling out here that, again, these gag orders absolutely exist, right? So not going to harp too much around this, though. I do want to mention here, again, the FBI obtained the image of the server as part of the investigation. And by the way here, part of the investigation into security researchers, right? So there's good old SB 315. Super happy that didn't pass in Georgia. Definitely helped lobby against that. And I was on a panel at B-Sides Augusta about that with a number of other really smart folks, smarter than me, in fact. But alas, talked a lot about how bad SB 315 was going to be, not just for Georgia residents, but also not just Georgia residents, but also the rest of the country. Right? SB 315 was a pretty sweeping bill, and one of the reasons that SB 315, really I should say one of the reasons, the onus for SB 315, if you talk to the sponsors of the bill in Georgia, and again did not pass. That's the important point. But if you talk to the sponsors of the bill in Georgia, they talk about this specific incident in 2016 where. And KSU, by the way, is Kent State University, which is involved in some of the election pieces there and whatnot, right? So alas, this KSU server had a huge amount of records, including some plain text passwords used to validate, election results, and you name it, just badness, right? So we're finding out more and more about what the server actually did as time goes on. Initially, unsurprisingly, government of Georgia really downplayed the significance of the server. Alas, here. It says those researchers were never accused of wrongdoing. Let's go ahead and set the record straight on that. Accused by whom? Criminally charged, criminally accused, that kind of, no. But I will tell you that was the onus for SB 315, where folks came and said, look, they downloaded the whole election database, right, from this open, basically it was an open directory on this web server. And the follow-up was, shouldn't that be illegal? Well, the answer for anybody who works in InfoSec is obviously no. It was just sitting out there. Now, the fact that they, used some forced browsing to get there, one could argue, a la Weave, in the good old AT&T case, one could argue that, that forced browsing is itself criminal-ish, whatever. If you're not familiar, Weave's case got overturned, not necessarily on appeal, but really technicality side. So forced browsing being hacking, meaning literally going to a specific URL for which there is not a link, was not shown. There's no precedent for that being hacking as a matter of law. Again, not a lawyer, seek your own legal advice, blah, blah, blah. But again, from a case law standpoint, as I understand it, that case being overturned means that is no longer a matter of law, that is hacking. And I think most of us in the industry agree that it's not. In fact, if you ever go to Hacker Conference and you see a sticker that says wget is not a crime, that's what they're talking about, right? And here again, kind of the same thing. So some of the SB 315 sponsors and co-sponsors of the bill talked specifically about this in oral arguments in the chambers, the legislative chambers, and they really talked quite a bit, quite a bit about this. And by the way, when I say SB 315, failed to pass, it passed both houses of the Georgia legislature. It went to Governor Nathan Deal's desk. Nathan Deal was still, I believe, is Deal? No, I think it was Deal at the time. I went to Deal's desk, and almost positive it's Deal. Anyway, I went to the governor's desk. Georgia's a little bit weird, though. It's not purely that laws pass, whether, basically it's the governor can basically have like a no contest here. And basically, if they don't sign the bill, but they don't veto the bill becomes law anyway, right? And that's kind of a weird thing for a state. But alas, it did pass both houses. Sat on the governor's desk until I believe the last day or the day before the last that he could veto it. But he took quite some time to veto it. So anyway, lots of people were really concerned about this. I suspect that's why basically the image was taken. But alas, look, when it comes down to it, and I'm not arguing with obviously the author. Frank does phenomenal work, but I will mention that a lot of lawmakers individually did say this was wrong. This is 100% wrong. They shouldn't have done this. And again, criminally versus when you have lawmakers trying to introduce new legislation, new cybersecurity legislation, around something, again, mincing words, whatever, I didn't have an editor go over my comments or anything, so I get it, right? But I do want to mention here that there were definitely some accusations, however you word accusations there. That said, I want to mention here as well that basically through Freedom of Information Act, to the Associated Press. I presume this is Frank that did this as well. Again, just phenomenal reporter. But basically said basically once the image was done, they put it in a case file and done. Again, when we look at this, we don't know whether or not the FBI ever looked at the image, and for that matter, what did they do with the image and all that, right? So again, a lot of folks will focus on the fact that the FBI had this, but again, there's no evidence that they looked at this from a nation state hacking kind of standpoint versus the securing the server. Again, getting an image of it in March 2017, which critically is the same month, right? And again, we don't have the actual date the image was taken, or I don't have that available, right off the bat. But again, remember in March 2017, Lamb and his associates contacted KSU again and said, hey, this server, this thing that we notified you about last year, and by the way, checks watch, it's March, right? It's still out there. It's still vulnerable. It's still here. What the deuce, right? Finally, one more thing I want to note here. This is not necessarily, indicative of nation state, but let's say that this is, and even I'm even not even going to go so far as to say like super sophisticated, because there's kind of a note here, and they're like, hey, typical of a seasoned hacker, and no question, right? But we see this in automated CMS attacks all the time. Now, what we don't know yet is the specific attack that was used to compromise Drupal, as well as the specific timing around that. I think that's going to be a really, really interesting piece in this case. to know, again, was this a public vulnerability that was used? But the patching of this, particularly in these automated CMS exploits, very, very common. Common that we see this, where an attacker compromises the server and then immediately patches so that they own the server and a bunch of others don't. And on a CMS, this is actually fairly easy to do. It's usually changing a couple lines of PHP, go PHP, and that's pretty much it. So anyway, want to sum this up here very quickly. Again, we now know that there were signs that that files were deleted, immediately after or shortly after KSU was notified again. Files that appear to be, certainly election related in nature. I highly suspect this is from modification times on directories. So if you delete files in a directory, it's going to update the modification time. And you can compare the last modification time on the directory to the last modification time of the newest file in the directory and say, there's something missing here, even if you don't know what it is, right? Now, depending on a number of other, forensic artifacts and what can you recover, etc. That's way beyond, what we can cover here, as well as not knowing all the specifics about how the image was taken and all that, right? So, but that said, that itself is concerning. It certainly points to spoliation, prior to a forensic image being taken. I think the more concerning part is, and again, without background of having to analyze or having the opportunity to analyze this specific image, I think the two more concerning parts actually. One, certainly the fact that Lamb has been under a protective order to prevent him from talking to the press. Right? I think that's. I don't know. I mean, yes, I understand we don't want to cause a panic. We don't want to undermine confidence in the state's election system. I can imagine there's a lot of folks, Kemp included, who super at the moment do not want to undermine any feels about the election system in Georgia. But wow. Secondarily, I think that the other big thing to note is again, November 10th, 2016. That's as far back as the logs go, conveniently missing day of and day after election. And again, no normal retention pattern on a server matches that, right? And I think that's probably the biggest thing for me. I just don't. I'm having a hard time reconciling that, right? And again, right, if we're talking about taking, basically, just pure failure to preserve here, and again, any reasonable individual would have preserved those logs on such a system, because remember, this system was known to have been known to have been open to the internet in 2016 and leaking voter registration data. Of course, we've come to find out there was other interesting data on the server. Of course, I'll link this story in the video notes. But wow, thanks to the Associated Press and thanks to Frank for breaking this story. Just phenomenal. And of course, this is going to be a case to watch because we're rolling into the 2020 elections, and of course everybody's screaming about how important election security is, but what are they doing about it? I'd like to see some very, very pointed questions coming from the press to different state, and whether it's the whether it's the Secretary of State, whether it's the Attorney General, depends on your state that's responsible for that, responsible for elections and investigations, and et cetera, et cetera. Typically it is, I think, the Secretary of State in most states. It certainly is here in Georgia. But I'd like to see some pointed questions going out to say, hey, what are you doing to secure? And I'm not talking about touchscreen ballots versus paper ballots, although yes, paper ballots for the win, right? But yeah, when it comes down to it, what are you doing to protect the back ends, right? And as well, what are you logging, for goodness sakes? And how are you preserving that? And will you keep those logs and have them available? Again, we're not talking about today, although I don't think it's unreasonable, by the way, knowing about everything that happened in the 2016 election, even rolling 30 days past that, knowing the controversies around it. I don't think it's unreasonable to say that any server, any machines involved with those elections, hard drive space is cheap. Effing preserve those logs, man. I just, wow. I have such a hard time here seeing that in March of 2017, we're missing the most critical logs, the stuff rolling up to the election day, right? I just don't understand that, right? That is something that for me is, I don't want to say the words inexcusable, but I just have such a hard time getting there. Anyway, enough of that. Just wanted to provide some context around this and how I read it as somebody that does a lot of incident response and security work. I can tell you that this, what's being described here, is not normal. You can take the conspiracy stuff out there. So anyway, Jake Williams from Dish and InfoSec, signing off.